I survived a car crash that should have killed me. My brakes failed on a steep hill in Atlanta, sending my truck smashing into a solid concrete barrier. When I woke up in the hospital with a shattered leg, fractured ribs, and a badly bruised spine, I truly thought the worst of my nightmare was over. I thought my daughter Rachel taking me into her beautiful suburban home was a blessing. I thought I was finally safe. But I was dead wrong. Exactly 1 week after I moved in, my 7-year-old granddaughter Lily crept up to my wheelchair. She grabbed my sleeve, her little hands shaking violently. She looked over her shoulder, absolutely terrified, and whispered, "Grandpa, you should not stay here." Then she pulled me toward a dark hallway in the basement. And what I saw behind a locked door made me wish I had died in that car crash. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The massive house my daughter Rachel and her husband Greg owned in the wealthy suburbs of Alpharetta was dead silent. They called it a mansion. It had towering vaulted ceilings, pristine marble floors, and way too many empty rooms. To outsiders, it looked like a palace. To me, it felt much more like a museum, cold and utterly devoid of life. I was sitting in my wheelchair by the large bay window, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn. My right leg was encased in a heavy plaster cast, propped up awkwardly on the elevated leg rest of the chair. Every time my heart beat, a dull, relentless, throbbing pain echoed deep inside the shattered bones of my leg. I am 71 years old. My name is Rick. For 40 years of my life, I worked as a structural engineer. I designed suspension bridges, highway overpasses, and massive structures of steel and concrete meant to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I spent my life calculating load-bearing weights and stress points, ensuring that things would not collapse under heavy pressure. My hands, heavily calloused and scarred from decades on dusty construction sites, used to bend iron and grip heavy tools with ease. I was a man who built things that lasted. But now, sitting in this freezing, overly air-conditioned room, I felt completely useless. I was trapped inside a broken, failing body, unable to even walk to the kitchen to get a simple glass of water without someone assisting me. The silence of the sprawling house was suffocating. Rachel and Greg were out running errands, or so they had casually mentioned over breakfast. They had supposedly hired a private medical nurse who was scheduled to arrive later that afternoon. For the moment, I was entirely alone, or at least I thought I was alone. Suddenly, I heard the soft, hesitant padding of small feet on the hardwood floor behind me. I turned my head, slowly wincing as my bruised ribs protested the sudden movement. It was Lily, my granddaughter. She was 7 years old, a sweet girl with blonde hair and usually a bright smile that could light up any room. But today, there was no smile on her face. She crept into the living room, as if she were trying to avoid waking a sleeping monster. She did not skip. She did not hum a happy tune. She moved with a strange, heavy caution that no child her age should ever possess. She stopped right next to my wheelchair. I looked down at her, forcing a warm, reassuring smile despite the sharp ache radiating through my chest. "Hello there, sweetie," I said, keeping my voice low and gentle so I would not startle her. "Are you playing a game of hide-and-seek today?" She did not answer my question. Instead, she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my faded flannel shirt. Her little fingers were clutching the worn fabric so tightly that her tiny knuckles turned completely white. She leaned in close to my arm, her breath warm and rapid. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly it broke my heart into pieces. "You should not stay here." I froze completely. The forced smile faded from my face in an instant. I looked deeply into her wide, terrified blue eyes. Children have a very specific look when they are afraid of the dark, or when they think there is a monster hiding under their bed. I raised my own daughter, so I knew that look well. But this was not a childhood fear. This was pure, unadulterated terror. It was the look of someone who had seen something incredibly real and incredibly dangerous. "Lily, what are you talking about?" I asked softly, shifting my weight in the chair. "Is everything okay? Did Mommy or Daddy scold you for something?" She shook her head rapidly, her eyes darting nervously toward the grand staircase in the foyer, as if she expected someone to come marching down at any second. No, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the air conditioning. You have to go. You have to leave today. Look, she tugged on my sleeve, again pulling me gently, but firmly, toward the hallway that led to the private residential elevator. Because of my wheelchair, they had told me I was strictly restricted to the main floor. The elevator went down to the expansive basement, a place Greg used for his home office and extra storage. I had never been down there since I arrived. Show me, I said, my voice dropping to a serious whisper. I gripped the metal rims of my wheelchair. The cold steel felt familiar beneath my calloused palms, but my arms were terribly weak from weeks of lying in a hospital bed. With every single push of the wheels, a sharp stabbing pain shot up my right shoulder, radiating down into my fractured ribs. The thick rubber tires squeaked faintly against the pristine marble floors, a sound that seemed absolutely deafening in the unnatural quiet of the giant house. I pushed through the pain, following the little girl. Lily walked right beside me, keeping her small hand firmly on my arm. We reached the elevator doors. She reached up on her tiptoes and pressed the glowing down button. The doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime. I rolled myself inside the wood-paneled cab and she followed, hitting the button for the basement level. The descent was agonizingly slow. My heart was pounding against my ribcage, heavy and fast, like a steel hammer striking a heavy anvil. I tried desperately to convince myself that this was just a child's overactive imagination. Maybe she had watched a scary movie on her tablet. Maybe she misunderstood a complicated adult conversation. But my gut, the deep instinct honed by decades of anticipating structural failures before they even happened, was screaming at me loudly. Something in this house was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The elevator doors finally opened to the basement. It was not a dark, unfinished cellar with exposed pipes. It was a sprawling, fully finished lower level, with plush gray carpets and bright recessed lighting. The air down here felt significantly cooler, almost sterile, like a hospital corridor. Lily stepped out first. She did not let go of my sleeve. She guided me down a long, narrow hallway lined with several closed doors. At the very end of the hall was a heavy, solid oak door. It was Greg's private office. Or at least, that is exactly what Rachel had told me on my first day here. She had explicitly said it was off-limits because Greg had highly sensitive client financial files in there. But as we got closer, I saw that the heavy door was not fully shut. It was left ajar by just an inch or two, allowing a thin sliver of harsh white fluorescent light to spill out onto the dark carpet. Lily stopped about 10 feet away from the door. She let go of my sleeve and took a large step back, wrapping her arms around her own small torso, as if she were freezing cold. She pointed a violently trembling finger at the sliver of light shining through the crack. In there, she whispered, tears finally welling up in her eyes and spilling down her pale cheeks. I saw it this morning when Daddy left. Please, Grandpa. Look. I swallowed hard. My throat felt exactly like dry sandpaper. I gripped the wheels of my chair and pushed myself forward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the glowing crack in the door. The silence in the basement was so heavy, it felt like deep water pressing violently against my eardrums. I reached out with a shaking hand and placed my palm flat against the cool wood of the oak door. I took a deep, painful breath, bracing myself for whatever childish misunderstanding lay behind it. But as I pushed the door open, the reality of the situation hit me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The room was not an office. The truth waiting inside was so horrific, so incredibly calculated and cruel, that my blood ran ice cold, and the peaceful, loving family life I thought I knew shattered instantly into a million unfixable pieces. I pushed the heavy oak door the rest of the way open. It swung inward on freshly oiled hinges, making absolutely no sound. The air inside did not smell like printer ink or old books you would expect from a home office. Instead, it was the sterile, unforgiving stench of rubbing alcohol-bleached sheets and chemical antiseptics. My eyes adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting humming overhead. I blinked, trying to make sense of the room. As an engineer, my brain is hardwired to process spatial reality instantly. But right then, my logical brain completely stalled. There was no mahogany desk. There were no filing cabinets tucked into the corners. There was no glowing computer monitor displaying stock market trends. The center of the room was dominated by a single terrifying piece of machinery. It was a heavy-duty motorized medical bed. The thick frame was industrial steel painted a dull, clinical gray. But it was not the cold metal that made my stomach drop. It was what was attached to the rails. Thick, dark leather restraints, 4 of them, 2 at the head of the bed and 2 at the foot. They were bolted into the steel frame with heavy industrial rivets, the kind of reinforced hardware you use to tie down heavy cargo, not frail human beings. I rolled my wheelchair closer, my breathing becoming shallow and erratic. I reached out a trembling hand and brushed my fingertips against the leather strap meant for a right wrist. It was brand new, thick, and completely unyielding, fastened with heavy metal buckles. I spent my career studying tensile strength. I knew load-bearing capacities intimately. These restraints were not meant to keep an elderly patient from rolling out of bed. They were meticulously designed to hold down a fully grown man who was fighting back with every ounce of his strength. They were designed to keep someone completely trapped. A wave of profound nausea washed over my body. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breakfast down. Why would Rachel, the little girl I taught to ride a bicycle, have a psychiatric restraint bed hidden in the basement of her luxury home? I tore my eyes away from the bed and looked toward the far wall. A massive 6-foot-wide whiteboard was mounted against the drywall. It was covered in paperwork held up by dozens of small black magnets. I pushed the wheels of my chair forward, ignoring the burning pain shooting up my broken leg. I needed to see what was on that board. As I got within 3 feet of it, the breath left my lungs. The documents were not Greg and his commercial real estate contracts. They were mine. Every piece of paper on that board belonged to me. There were copies of my retirement account statements, my pension payouts, the deed to my house in Atlanta, and my investment portfolio summaries. Someone had gone through my private financial life with a fine-toothed comb. My total net worth, roughly $4.5 million, was circled multiple times in thick black ink at the very top of the board. But it was the writing in bright red marker beneath my bank statements that made the blood freeze in my veins. The handwriting was unmistakably Rachel, and her specific cursive style. I had seen her write birthday cards and grocery lists for 40 years. The red letters spelled out payment deadline October 15th. Right beneath that, in the same bright red marker, were the terrifying words, cognitive decline progressing. My mind spun out of control. Payment. Deadline cognitive decline. I was sharp as a tack. My memory was flawless. I had spent the week feeling slightly foggy, but I had attributed that to the painkillers and the concussion from my car crash. They were tracking a cognitive decline that did not exist. Or worse, a decline they were trying to artificially create. My eyes darted to a small stainless steel medical cart parked next to the head of the bed. On top of the cart sat a silver tray holding several orange prescription pill bottles. I wheeled myself over to the cart, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick one of the bottles up. I held it up to the fluorescent light. The patient name printed on the label read, Richard Dalton. My name. The prescribing doctor was someone I had never heard of in my life. I rotated the bottle to read the medication name. Haloperidol. 50 milligrams. I may be an old bridge engineer and not a doctor, but my late wife had been a registered nurse for 30 years. I knew enough about medications to know that haloperidol is a high-dose, severe antipsychotic drug. It is used to chemically subdue violent patients suffering from severe schizophrenia or advanced dementia. It is not a painkiller meant for a broken leg. It is a chemical straitjacket. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with horrifying clarity. The fogginess I felt every morning, the faint metallic taste in the orange juice Rachel handed me with breakfast every day, the sudden exhaustion that would hit me like a brick wall by noon. They were already drugging me. My own daughter and her husband were secretly poisoning me with antipsychotics to fake a cognitive decline, preparing to strap me to this horrific bed in their basement to steal the money I had worked 40 years to save. What would you do if you realized your own flesh and blood built a trap for you? Let me know in the comments below, because sitting in that wheelchair, staring at my own chemical execution, I felt a kind of heartbreak that no physical injury could ever match. The heavy silence of the basement suddenly shattered as the floorboards creaked violently directly above my head. My son-in-law Greg was walking directly toward the wooden staircase, and I was sitting completely paralyzed right inside his secret prison. Time was up. The rhythmic thud of expensive leather dress shoes echoed through the ceiling directly above me. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound I recognized instantly. Greg. My son-in-law was home. Judging by the determined weight of his footsteps, he was walking straight toward the foyer staircase leading down to this exact basement. Cold panic pierced through my chest. I had maybe 2 minutes before he reached the bottom. If he found me sitting in this room staring at a psychiatric bed and a whiteboard detailing his plan to steal my life savings, I knew I would never make it out of this house alive. Lily let out a stifled gasp. Her small hands flew up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute dread. She knew what her father was capable of. I desperately had to get her out of here. I reached out and grabbed her trembling shoulder. "Run quickly upstairs to your room, sweetie," I whispered, keeping my voice steady. "Do not tell him you were down here. Just go." She did not hesitate. She turned and darted down the hallway, her socks sliding silently against the gray carpet. She slipped into the shadows near the back staircase just as the heavy wooden door at the top of the main basement stairs groaned open. I gripped the cold metal rims of my wheelchair. My palms were slick with sweat. I clamped my jaw shut, bracing myself for the immense physical toll this would take on my broken body. I threw my weight backward, pulling the wheels with every ounce of strength I had left. The chair rolled backward out of the terrifying room. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the oak door. I pulled it shut, praying the freshly oiled hinges would remain perfectly silent. It clicked into the doorframe with a soft thud. I had to cross 40 feet of open hallway, get into the elevator, and make it to my bedroom before Greg rounded the corner. I began to push. My triceps burned instantly, screaming in protest as they bore the dead weight of the heavy steel chair and my immobilized body. Each thrust of my arms sent a shockwave of pain tearing through my bruised spine and fractured ribs. But the worst pain came from my right leg. The thick plaster cast felt like an anchor made of solid lead. Because of the elevated leg rest, every time the wheels hit even the slightest uneven patch of carpet, the vibration shot straight into my shattered tibia. It felt like someone was repeatedly striking my shin bone with a hot iron hammer. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw popped. I could not afford to make a single sound. The heavy thud of Greg walking down the wooden stairs grew louder and more distinct. He was taking his time, probably checking his phone, unaware that his sinister plot was unraveling just a few yards away. I reached the elevator doors and slammed the heel of my good left foot against the call button. The wait felt like an absolute eternity. Seconds stretched into hours. Sweat began to pour down my forehead, stinging my eyes and blurring my vision. My heart was hammering against my ribcage so violently that I feared I might have a heart attack right there in the hallway. "Come on," I prayed silently, watching the digital floor indicator above the door. Finally, the metal doors slid open. I threw myself backward, yanking the wheels aggressively to spin the chair around. I reversed into the small cabin and frantically smashed the button for the main floor. The doors began to close just as I heard Greg reach the bottom landing. His leather shoes stepped off the wood and onto the carpet. If he turned his head left, he would see the doors sliding shut. I held my breath, pressing myself far back against the rear wall. The doors snapped shut. The cabin began to slowly ascend. I let out a shaky breath, wiping the stinging sweat from my eyes. But I was not safe yet. The metal elevator reached the main floor with a soft chime. I pushed the doors open before they could even fully retract. I was completely exhausted, my old lungs burning for oxygen, but pure adrenaline forced me forward. I wheeled out into the bright foyer. The plush Persian rugs in the front living room were an absolute nightmare for the rubber tires. I had to push twice as hard to maintain any forward momentum. I could hear the basement door opening again. Greg was slowly coming back up. I wheeled frantically down the long corridor toward the guest suite they had converted into my bedroom. My muscles were giving out. My hands were blistered and raw from the harsh friction of the metal rims. I reached my door, shoved it open, and rolled myself inside. I spun the heavy chair around, shown to face the window, panting heavily. I desperately needed a solid alibi. I reached out blindly toward the small mahogany nightstand beside my bed and grabbed the first object my fingers brushed against. It was a thick, hardcover novel Rachel had left there. I flipped it open randomly and dropped it onto my lap, resting my shaking hands on the open pages. I took one final massive gulp of air and forced my breathing to slow down into a steady, rhythmic pace. I commanded my facial muscles to completely relax, masking the sheer terror and physical agony coursing through every nerve of my body. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom. The brass doorknob turned slowly. The door swung open, revealing Greg standing in the threshold. He wore a tailored suit, his eyes dark and calculating. He stared at me in total silence for a long, agonizing moment. I slowly looked up from my book, blinked twice, and offered him the tired, confused smile of a completely helpless old man. Greg stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as they darted from my face to the heavy cast on my leg, and finally to the thick, hardcover book resting on my lap. I held my breath, burying the panic deep inside my chest. I made sure my hands trembled just enough to look like the frail, exhausted father they expected me to be. After what felt like hours, the hard lines of his jaw finally relaxed. He let out a short, dismissive breath, clearly convinced that I had been sitting there all afternoon, lost in a book I could barely comprehend. Before he could say a single word, a bright, cheerful voice echoed from the hallway behind him. It was Rachel. She pushed past her husband, carrying a stack of neatly folded towels. She wore a pristine white blouse and a perfectly practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Oh, good, you are awake," she chimed, stepping into my room with a breezy, effortless grace. "Greg told me you were resting. How is the pain today, Dad?" I carefully closed the book and set it on the nightstand, letting out a long, theatrical sigh. "The pain is manageable, sweetie," I lied, my voice wavering perfectly. But my mind feels incredibly cloudy today. In fact, I got a little confused earlier. I was trying to find the linen closet to grab an extra blanket, and I ended up rolling down the hallway near the elevator. I pressed the wrong button and accidentally went down to the basement. I paused, letting the silence hang heavily in the room. Greg instantly stiffened. His shoulders locked and his dark eyes locked onto mine, like a predator sensing a threat. But Rachel did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not drop the towels. Her smile never faltered for a fraction of a second. She casually set the towels at the foot of my bed and tilted her head, looking at me with an expression of pure, condescending pity. "Oh, Dad, you should not be wandering around down there by yourself," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You could easily hurt yourself with that heavy cast. What were you doing in the basement?" I kept my expression blank, channeling my discipline from 4 decades of engineering negotiations. "Well, I noticed a door was left open at the end of the hall," I said, making my voice sound weak and uncertain. "I thought it was Greg's home office. But I saw a strange medical bed in there. It had these thick leather straps on the frame, and there was a large whiteboard on the wall with all my bank statements and retirement accounts pinned to it. I was just a little confused, Rachel. What exactly is that room for the psychological chess match officially began? I watched her face closely, waiting for a crack in her perfect facade. A stammer, a nervous glance at Greg, a sudden change in her breathing pattern. But there was absolutely nothing. Rachel walked over and gently patted my shoulder, her touch feeling like a block of solid ice against my skin. "Oh, that room," she laughed softly, a bright sound making my stomach churn. "We wanted it to be a surprise, but I guess you ruined it. That is your new physical therapy studio, Dad. The doctors said you are going to need intense rehabilitation once that cast comes off. The bed is specially designed for resistance training. Those straps are actually just heavy-duty tension bands to help you stretch your atrophied muscles safely without falling." She looked me dead in the eye, her gaze steady and warm. I stared back at her, internally reeling from the absolute perfection of her lie. She was smooth. She was terrifyingly convincing. If I had not seen the high-dose antipsychotic medication sitting on that cart, I might have actually believed her. "And what about the whiteboard with my financial documents?" I asked, forcing a small, confused chuckle. It looked like a bank vault down there. Greg stepped forward, his hands deep in his tailored trousers. His smooth voice perfectly matched his wife's performance. "That is just me trying to keep your life organized, Richard," he said calmly. "With your hospital bills and ongoing insurance claims, things are just getting complicated. We pinned your statements up there to build a clear budget strategy. We want your retirement fund completely protected while you heal. Your cognitive state has been a bit foggy since the accident, so we are handling the heavy lifting for you. There is absolutely nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about." The words echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. I looked at Rachel, my only child. I looked at the delicate features of her face, the face I had kissed goodnight 1,000 times. Suddenly, a vivid memory flashed behind my eyes. I was 45 years old, working an 80-hour week on a grueling bridge project in the dead of winter. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the freezing steel. I took extra shifts just so I could afford the designer prom dress she desperately wanted. I remembered the pure joy on her face when I brought it home. I gave her everything I had. I built a mountain of sacrifices so she could stand on top of it. Now she was lying to my face while plotting to destroy my mind and steal everything. But I could not let them see my true heartbreak. I had to play their sick game flawlessly. I let out a shaky breath, allowing immense relief to wash over my exhausted face. "Thank you, sweetie," I whispered, forcing fake tears into my eyes. "I am so terribly sorry for doubting you." Rachel squeezed my hand, her painted lips curling into a triumphant smile. "You do not have to thank us, Dad," she murmured softly. "We will take care of you forever." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the suffocating quiet of the guest bedroom. "We will take care of you forever." Her final words hung in the stale air-conditioned breeze like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the closed door, my heart pounding a slow, agonizing rhythm against my bruised ribs. The sheer magnitude of her deception began to settle over me, chilling my skin beneath the thin cotton blanket. The afternoon sun slowly dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat frozen in my wheelchair, trapped in a house that had suddenly transformed into a maximum security prison. I tried to steady my breathing, but the adrenaline from my frantic escape from the basement was finally wearing off, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. Every bone in my body throbbed. My broken leg felt like it was encased in solid iron, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological torment spiraling inside my mind. I was a man who built things based on logic, structural integrity, and measurable facts. Now the foundation of my entire reality was completely crumbling beneath me. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the chair, waiting for the inevitable next move. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The digital clock on the mahogany nightstand glowed a harsh red, displaying 7 o'clock. Right on schedule, the door handle turned with a soft click. Rachel walked in carrying an ornate silver serving tray. The rich, savory aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the room, a smell that normally would have made my mouth water. She set the heavy tray down on the small rolling table beside my bed and carefully adjusted the napkin. "I made homemade chicken soup for you, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with that same terrifyingly artificial sweetness. "I also brought you a tall glass of fresh orange juice. You need your vitamin C to help those bones knit back together." She pushed the rolling table directly over my lap, patting my shoulder affectionately. I looked down at the meal. Steam curled gently from the porcelain bowl, swirling above the golden broth. The tall crystal glass beside it was filled with brightly colored juice condensation, dripping slowly down the sides. It looked like the perfect loving meal, prepared by a devoted daughter. I forced my hands to remain steady as I reached for the heavy silver spoon. "Thank you, Rachel," I murmured, keeping my eyes locked on the bowl. "This looks absolutely wonderful." She smiled, stepping back toward the door. "Eat every last drop, Dad. You need your strength. Have a good night." She closed the door behind her, leaving me alone with the food. I stared at the tray for a long time. My stomach growled violently, reminding me that I had not eaten a single thing since breakfast. I picked up the spoon and dipped it into the warm broth, bringing a small amount to my lips. It tasted completely normal, savory, salty, and rich. I swallowed it smoothly, feeling the warmth spread down my throat. I took another spoonful, then a third. The soup was fine. I set the spoon down and reached for the crystal glass of orange juice. The cold condensation slipped against my rough, calloused fingers. I brought the rim of the glass to my mouth and took a slow, deliberate sip. Instantly, every alarm bell in my brain began to ring. As a structural engineer, my senses were honed by decades spent on industrial construction sites. I had spent my entire life working around volatile chemical solvents, heavy metallic compounds, and industrial sealants. I knew exactly what natural elements were supposed to smell and taste like. Beneath the overwhelming sweetness of the concentrated citrus, there was something else. It was faint, incredibly subtle, but undeniably present. It was a harsh, synthetic, metallic bitterness that coated the very back of my tongue. It tasted like a crushed alkaline battery mixed with industrial chalk. I froze, the cold glass hovering just inches from my face. My breathing hitched as a wave of pure, unfiltered horror washed over me. I slowly lowered the glass back onto the silver tray, my hands now trembling so violently that the orange liquid sloshed against the rim. The horrifying realization struck me with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. The heavy brain fog I had been struggling with every single morning, the terrifying memory lapses where I could not remember conversations from just hours before, the profound, debilitating exhaustion that kept me chained to this wheelchair, unable to even lift my own arms by mid-afternoon. The doctors at the hospital had told me the mild concussion would cause headaches, not complete cognitive failure. I had spent the entire week believing that my brain was naturally failing me, that the violent car crash had permanently damaged my mind. But it was all a manufactured lie. It was not a concussion. It was not old age. It was the haloperidol, the heavy-dose antipsychotic medication I had seen downstairs on the medical cart. My own daughter, the child I had cradled in my arms and protected from every harm in the world, was systematically crushing pills and dissolving them into my daily drinks. She was deliberately sedating me chemically, inducing an artificial state of dementia to destroy my mental capacity. The sheer cruelty of her plan paralyzed my heart. She wanted to erase my dignity, to reduce me to a drooling shell so she could easily take legal control over my life. She was manufacturing a medical crisis to justify locking me in that basement bed forever. Every sip of juice I consumed over the past 7 days was slowly poisoning my nervous system. I stared at the bright orange liquid, feeling a sickening surge of betrayal burn through my chest. I was completely trapped. I was completely alone. But I refused to be a victim in my own family's twisted game. The initial shock began to morph into a deep, burning anger. I looked at the tray. If Rachel came back and found the soup untouched and the juice full, she would know I suspected something. I had to play the part of the obedient, fading father perfectly. I wheeled my chair slowly toward the corner of the room where a large decorative potted ficus tree stood. It was a massive ceramic pot filled with dark, loose soil. I picked up the crystal glass with shaking hands, leaning over the edge of the pot. I poured the poisoned orange juice directly into the dirt, watching the thick liquid seep into the roots. I did the same with the chicken soup, burying the meat and vegetables deep beneath the topsoil so it would not smell. I left just a tiny amount of broth at the bottom of the bowl and a few drops of juice in the glass, making it look as though I had eagerly consumed every last bit. I pushed my wheelchair back to the center of the room, parked it by the bed, and waited for the night to fall. When Rachel finally came back to collect the tray, she smiled brilliantly, praising me for having such a healthy appetite. I nodded sluggishly, closing my eyes and letting my head loll to the side, pretending the heavy sedatives were already pulling me under. She turned off the main lights, leaving only the dim glow of the hallway, and gently pulled the door shut. The lock clicked. As soon as the sound echoed through the room, I opened my eyes. The darkness was absolute, but my mind was beginning to spark with a brilliant, terrifying clarity. For the first time in 7 agonizing days, my body was not processing a fresh dose of heavy antipsychotic medication. The hours crawled by in painful silence. Around 2 in the morning, the physical withdrawal began. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My hands trembled violently, and a dull, throbbing ache radiated through my skull as my brain fought to flush the residual chemicals from my bloodstream. I gripped the thick fabric of my bedsheets, grinding my teeth against the nausea. I would not call out for help. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. By the time the faint gray light of dawn began to creep through the window blinds, the heavy, suffocating fog that had clouded my thoughts for a week was finally gone. My mind was sharp. The sluggish confusion was replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a structural engineer. I lay there in the quiet room, staring at the ceiling, and began to analyze my situation the exact same way I would analyze a collapsing bridge. Every structural failure has a root cause. You just have to follow the cracks. If Rachel and Greg were willing to chemically lobotomize me to steal my retirement funds, what else were they capable of? The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My car crash, the accident that put me in this wheelchair and made me completely dependent on them. I replayed the terrible memory in my mind. I had been driving my truck, a vehicle I maintained with absolute perfection, down a steep, familiar hill in Atlanta. When I pressed my foot against the brake pedal, there was no resistance. The pedal slammed flat against the floorboard. The brake lines had completely failed, sending me crashing into a solid concrete barrier at 60 miles an hour. The police report had called it a catastrophic mechanical failure. I had believed them. But brake lines on a well-maintained truck do not just spontaneously fail. They have to be cut. They have to be tampered with. Greg owned a commercial real estate business that was constantly bleeding money. He had access to my garage. He knew exactly when I took my weekly drive down that steep canyon road. The crash was not an accident. It was a failed assassination attempt. When the crash did not kill me, they panicked. They needed a backup plan to get my money before I recovered and went back to my independent life. So they brought me into their home, locked me in a guest room, and started poisoning my food to legally declare me incompetent. The sheer magnitude of their evil was breathtaking. They wanted me dead, and when that did not work, they decided to bury me alive inside my own mind. I was a burden they wanted to erase completely from this earth, but they wanted to squeeze every last dollar out of my suffering first. Have you ever been betrayed by the person you protected your whole life? Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you loved and realized you were staring at a stranger who wanted to destroy you? Let me know in the comments below. Because I promise you, the isolation of that moment is a darkness I would not wish on my worst enemy. But they made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They thought I was just a weak, broken old man who would quietly fade away into the shadows. They forgot who I really was. I spent 40 years calculating the breaking point of steel and concrete. I knew exactly how to dismantle a massive structure piece by piece until the whole thing came crashing down. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a wheelchair. I was an engineer, and it was time to systematically demolish the lives of the people who tried to bury me. Their entire plan relied on my silence. They believed I was trapped. They truly believed I was at their mercy. But they were wrong. I was awake. I was angry. And I was going to teach them a devastating lesson they would never forget. The hunt had officially begun. The morning sun filtered through the heavy bedroom blinds, casting thin, pale lines of light across my blankets. I had barely slept, spending the remaining long, dark hours of the night running through every possible scenario in my head. When the doorknob finally clicked at 9 o'clock, I immediately let my jaw go slack and allowed my eyes to glaze over. I slouched deeply into my pillows, the picture of a broken, sedated old man. Rachel walked into the room briskly, bringing with her the overwhelming scent of her expensive floral perfume. But she was not alone. Behind her stood a man who looked like he belonged in a maximum security prison yard rather than a luxury suburban home. Dad, Rachel chirped, her voice bouncing off the walls with that sickeningly fake enthusiasm. I have wonderful news. We finally found a private physical therapist who can do in-home visits. This is Todd. He is going to help you get your strength back. I slowly turned my head, blinking several times, as if it took monumental effort just to process her words. I looked at the man standing at the foot of my bed. My mind, now completely clear of the heavy antipsychotics, began to analyze him with the rapid, cold precision of a forensic investigator. Todd did not say a single word of greeting. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over his massive chest, staring down at me with cold, dead eyes. He was wearing a set of pale blue medical scrubs, but they fit him terribly, stretching tightly across his bulging shoulders and thick neck. He looked like a bouncer in a stolen hospital uniform. As an engineer, I was trained to spot structural anomalies that indicate a larger hidden problem. Todd was a walking anomaly. Real medical professionals carry an air of clinical calm. They have clipboards, blood pressure cuffs, or at the very least, a gentle bedside manner. Todd carried absolutely nothing. His hands hung loosely at his sides, and I noticed his knuckles. They were heavily calloused, scarred, and flattened, the unmistakable hands of a man who spent his life punching things, not healing them. But the most glaring red flag was on the left side of his thick neck. He had attempted to conceal it with a heavy layer of flesh-colored makeup, but the sweat from the morning heat had caused the foundation to streak. Beneath the smeared makeup, I could clearly see the jagged dark blue ink of a prison gang tattoo poking out above his collar. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my breathing shallow and erratic, playing the part of the confused patient. Rachel patted my foot through the blanket. "I have to go run to the bank, Dad," she said brightly. "Todd is going to do a preliminary assessment on your leg and help you with some stretches. You be good for him, okay?" She turned on her heel and practically skipped out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. The heavy click of the lock echoing in the quiet room sounded like a death sentence. I was now locked in a small room with a violent thug hired by my own family. Todd slowly walked over to the side of my bed. He did not wash his hands. He did not ask me how I was feeling or check my medical chart. He simply grabbed the edge of my heavy plaster cast with his rough, scarred hands. "Well, old man," Todd muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Let us see how much damage you really have." Without any warning whatsoever, he wrapped his massive fingers around my shattered shin and squeezed. He did not perform a therapeutic stretch. He did not test my range of motion. He dug his thick thumbs directly into the soft tissue just above my fracture line and applied a brutal, deliberate pressure. The pain was instantaneous and absolutely blinding. It felt exactly like hot iron driving straight through my skin into cracked bone. A sharp gasp escaped my lips, and my entire body went rigid. Sweat instantly beaded on my forehead as my nervous system screamed in agony. But I knew I could not fight back. If I showed him the strength and clarity I actually possessed, they would know the drugs were not working. They would accelerate their plan. So I forced myself to react exactly how a heavily sedated, helpless old man would. I let out a weak, pathetic whimper, letting my head roll to the side as if I lacked the motor control to push him away. Todd leaned in much closer, his face hovering just inches from mine. I could smell stale cigarette smoke and strong black coffee on his breath. He increased the pressure on my broken leg, watching my eyes closely. He was looking for a spark of defiance, a reason to escalate the violence. He was establishing complete and total dominance. This was not a medical evaluation. This was a silent, agonizing threat. He was showing me exactly what would happen if I caused any trouble for Rachel and Greg. My vision blurred from excruciating pain, but I kept my eyes completely dull and entirely unfocused. I let a tear slip down my cheek, playing the role of the broken victim to absolute perfection. After what felt like an eternity, Todd finally released his iron grip on my leg. He took a step back, wiping his hands on his scrub pants with a look of pure disgust. "Yeah, you are pretty far gone, aren't you?" he sneered, turning his back on me. "You are not going to be a problem at all." He walked over to the window, completely ignoring me as I lay there trembling. He had just confirmed my darkest fears. He was not a physical therapist. He was a ruthless enforcer, brought into my home to guarantee my total submission. Todd turned away from the window, the harsh morning light casting long, menacing shadows across his broad shoulders. He walked slowly back to the side of my bed, the heavy thud of his boots echoing like a ticking clock in the quiet room. He did not bother to adjust the pillows or offer a comforting word. Instead, he grabbed my right ankle, his scarred fingers digging into the sensitive skin just below the edge of the plaster cast. He lifted my leg a few inches off the mattress, sending a fresh wave of blinding pain shooting up my spine. But this time I was ready. I buried the urge to scream, letting my jaw hang loose and allowing my eyes to drift toward the ceiling, perfectly mimicking the vacant stare of a heavily sedated patient. "All right, Richard," Todd muttered, his voice dropping into a low, conversational tone that completely contradicted the brutal pressure he was applying to my fractured bones. "Rachel tells me you used to be a pretty smart guy. Built bridges or something, right? You probably made a lot of money doing that." I let out a weak, sputtering cough, turning my head slowly to look at him. "Bridges," I mumbled, my voice trembling and thick as if my tongue were swollen. "Yes. Steel, heavy steel, we built them strong." Todd chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that rattled in his throat. He twisted my ankle slightly, just enough to make me gasp. "Yeah, well, steel rusts, old man. Speaking of heavy things, your daughter mentioned you have a nice big safe back at your house in Atlanta. Said you keep all your important papers in there. She is trying to help you organize your life, but her memory is a little fuzzy." What was the combination to that safe again? My heart raced, but my expression remained entirely blank. The safe in my master bedroom in Atlanta contained my original will, the deeds to several properties, and the physical bearer bonds I had purchased decades ago. If they got into that safe, they could liquidate hundreds of thousands of dollars before the conservatorship was even finalized. I stared at Todd, letting a thin trail of saliva pool at the corner of my mouth. "Safe," I repeated slowly, blinking, as if trying to grasp the concept of the word. "The green safe." Todd leaned in closer, his stale breath washing over my face. "Yeah, the green safe. Give me the numbers, Richard." Make things easy on yourself. I closed my eyes, furrowing my brow in a manufactured display of intense confusion. 4, I whispered faintly. 4, then 18. And wait, no. It was 32. My wife chose it. She loved the number 32. Todd sighed heavily, pulling a small, battered notebook and a black pen from the pocket of his tight scrubs. He scribbled the numbers down, pressing the pen so hard the paper nearly tore. 4/18/32, he repeated, glaring down at me. Are you sure about that, old man? Because if you are lying to me, these stretching exercises are going to get a whole lot more painful tomorrow. I let out a soft, pathetic whine, shaking my head weakly. No, wait, I stammered, raising a trembling hand to my forehead. Maybe it was 42. Yes, 42. Mary always said 42 was a lucky number. We got married in 42. I let my voice trail off into a meaningless mumble, intentionally mixing up my late wife's name and the year we were married. I knew those numbers would not open the heavy steel door in Atlanta. The actual combination was based on my granddaughter Lily's birth date, a sequence I would take to my grave before handing it over to this thug. Todd shoved the notebook back into his pocket, his patience visibly wearing incredibly thin. He dropped my leg back onto the mattress with a heavy thud, ignoring my sharp intake of breath. Fine, he growled. We will test those out later. But Rachel also needs your online banking passwords, the main accounts, the ones with the big retirement funds. And she is looking for your power of attorney documents. Where did you hide the hard copies, Richard? I rolled my head back toward the window, pretending to be completely lost in a drug-induced hallucination. The bank, I whispered, letting my eyelids flutter shut. The bank is on Elm Street. Nice teller. Her name is Susan. She always gives me a lollipop. I smiled vacantly, sinking deeper into the mattress. Power of attorney. I do not have a lawyer. The bridge is falling down. We need more concrete. Todd slammed his massive hand flat against the bedside table, rattling the plastic water pitcher. Cut the crap, Richard, he hissed, leaning over me until his face filled my entire field of vision. The passwords. Give them to me right now. I stared back at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes, letting a look of pure, childlike terror wash over my face. I do not know. I cried out softly, my voice cracking perfectly. Please, my leg hurts. I want my wife. I want Mary. Todd stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his dark eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. He was looking for the sharp, calculating engineer beneath the frail exterior. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I was an empty shell, a broken man whose mind had been completely destroyed by the medication. Finally, a look of profound disgust settled over his rugged features. He stood up straight, brushing his hands off, as if touching me had somehow soiled him. He turned his back without another word, stalking across the cold bedroom with heavy, frustrated steps. The heavy oak door clicked shut firmly behind him, locking me completely inside the chilling silence. I dropped the helpless act immediately, taking a deep, ragged breath, and knowing my only window of opportunity was rapidly closing forever. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut and the deadbolt slid firmly into place, my entire demeanor shifted. The trembling in my hands stopped. The vacant, cloudy expression I had painted across my face vanished, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. I sat up straighter against the pillows, wincing, as the residual pain from Todd, twisting my broken leg, flared up through my nervous system. My shin throbbed with a fiery intensity, a brutal reminder of the physical threat I was now under. I took a deep, ragged breath, forcing oxygen into my lungs to steady my racing heart. The chilling silence of the guest bedroom pressed down on me like a physical weight. My window of opportunity was rapidly closing forever. Todd was not a patient man. If I did not give them the real combination to my safe or the location of my power of attorney documents, soon the physical violence would inevitably escalate. I could not fight a man of his size, especially not while confined to this wheelchair with a shattered leg. I needed outside intervention. I needed legal and physical protection before Tuesday arrived, and the conservatorship was finalized in front of a judge. I reached over to the mahogany nightstand, opening the top drawer as quietly as I possibly could. My smartphone was resting inside, right next to the thick hardcover book I had used as a prop yesterday. I pulled the phone out the cool metal casing, feeling like a lifeline in my calloused palm. I unlocked the screen and immediately tapped on my contacts, scrolling down until I found the name Bradley Pierce. Bradley had been my trusted estate lawyer and close personal friend for over 2 decades. We had played golf together. He knew my financial portfolio inside and out, and more importantly, he knew I was not suffering from any form of cognitive decline. If I could just get him on the phone, if I could just explain the psychiatric bed in the basement and the haloperidol they were sneaking into my food, he would send the police to this house within 10 minutes. I tapped the green call button and lifted the phone to my ear, my chest tight with desperate anticipation. I waited for the familiar ringing sound. I waited for the automated voice of his receptionist. But there was absolutely nothing. The line was completely dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared down at the brightly lit screen. In the top right corner, where there should have been 4 solid bars of cellular reception, there was only a small gray circle with a diagonal line through it. The words "No service" hovered ominously at the top of the display. A cold knot formed tightly in the pit of my stomach. This made absolutely no sense. Alpharetta was a highly developed, affluent suburb. The cell towers were everywhere. I had full reception the day Rachel drove me home from the hospital. I tapped the screen frantically, trying to force the phone to search for a network signal. I toggled the airplane mode on and off, praying it was just a temporary software glitch. The gray circle remained. I was completely disconnected from the cellular network. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down, relying on my engineering background to find a logical workaround. If the cellular network was down, I could still use an internet connection to send Bradley an emergency email or make a wireless call. I opened the settings menu on my phone and navigated to the wireless networks page. The household network, which Rachel had proudly named the Mansion Hub when I first arrived, was listed right there. But there was a small lock icon next to it, and my phone was refusing to connect. I tapped the network name, and a prompt appeared on the screen asking for the password. I carefully typed in the password Rachel had given me on my first day here, a simple combination of her anniversary date and Greg's name. I hit join. The screen loaded for an agonizing 5 seconds before a red text box popped up declaring the password was incorrect. I typed it again, slower this time, making absolutely sure my shaking fingers did not hit the wrong digital keys. Incorrect password. I tried the birthday of Lily. Incorrect. I tried her maiden name. Incorrect. They had changed the wireless password. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate, calculated move to sever my only lifeline to the outside world. I stared at the useless piece of glass and metal in my hands. The knot in my stomach tightened into a painful cramp, but something absolute darkness. I lowered my bruised and battered body painfully back down to the cold hardwood floor. The agonizing journey down the long hallway awaited me once again, but I no longer felt the physical pain in my shattered leg. I only felt the freezing mechanical anticipation of delivering absolute justice. The return journey down that long, freezing corridor was entirely fueled by pure adrenaline and cold, calculated rage. My right leg still dragged behind me, encased in heavy plaster, but the physical pain had faded. My mind was sharp, whirring with the precision of a massive engine running at maximum capacity. I carefully navigated the warped floorboards with stealth, slipping through the shadows like a ghost in my own family's house. I finally reached the door of the guest bedroom, pushed it open, and dragged myself over the threshold. I closed the door quietly until the latch clicked shut, securing myself back inside the digital prison they had built for me. I hauled my exhausted, trembling body back up into the wheelchair, my breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. I did not bother to rest. There was absolutely no time to waste. Tuesday was approaching fast, and I needed to strike a devastating blow before the sun came up. I reached down into the battered leather tool bag and retrieved the hidden tablet, waking the screen to reveal the solid connection of the industrial cellular network. I plugged the small digital storage drive into the adapter port of the tablet. I opened my encrypted email client and immediately composed a message to Bradley Pierce. Bradley was not just a lawyer, he was a ruthless litigator who despised white-collar criminals. I typed his personal direct email address into the recipient bar. The subject line was simple but urgent. Emergency legal intervention required. Life or death. I attached every single file I had copied from Greg's computer. The forged psychiatric evaluations, the petition for the total conservatorship, the non-refundable deposit for the Pine Ridge Behavioral Asylum, the one-way first-class tickets to Belize, and finally, the handwritten receipt from the black market mechanic confirming the assassination attempt on my life. I kept the body of the email incredibly brief, knowing the documents would speak entirely for themselves. Bradley, I am being held against my will and chemically sedated by Rachel and Greg. They are attempting to steal my estate and flee the country. Do not call this house under any circumstances. Prepare the counter-evidence for the hearing on Tuesday morning. I will see you in court. I pressed send, watching the progress bar fill as the massive attachments flew through the encrypted network, safely landing in Bradley's inbox. But Bradley could only handle the legal defense. I needed heavy, undeniable offensive power to dismantle the violent loan shark syndicate threatening my home. I opened a secure browser window and navigated directly to the online portal for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically targeting the Financial Crimes and Organized Crime Division in Atlanta. I filled out an anonymous, high-priority tip form. I detailed the exact name of Greg's bankrupt firm, the $3 million debt he owed, and the physical description of the enforcer named Todd. I uploaded the audio recording I had captured earlier that night, the one where Todd explicitly threatened our lives and admitted to the extortion plot. I hit submit, knowing the federal agents would immediately begin tracing the digital footprints of the syndicate. With the authorities fully alerted, I turned my attention to the final and most crucial step of my plan. I had to completely neutralize the core motivation behind their entire horrific scheme: the money. I logged into the secure portal of my primary financial institution. I stared at the dashboard, which proudly displayed the cumulative result of my life's work. $4.5 million spread across various high-yield accounts and liquid portfolios. Rachel and Greg believed that securing the conservatorship on Tuesday would instantly give them the keys. I was about to change the locks permanently. I navigated to the estate planning section of the portal and initiated the immediate creation of an irrevocable trust. Unlike a standard will or a revocable trust, an irrevocable trust cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the beneficiary. Once the money is transferred into it, the grantor legally surrenders all ownership rights to those assets forever. I typed Lily's full legal name into the beneficiary field. I set the conditions of the trust to ensure she could not access the principal amount until she turned 25 years old, guaranteeing that Rachel and Greg could never touch a single penny of it, even as her parents. I selected all of my checking accounts, my savings accounts, my stock portfolios, and the deed to my property in Atlanta. I moved every single asset into the transfer queue. The system prompted me for a secondary authentication to confirm the massive transfer of wealth. I typed in my master password and pressed the digital signature pad. My calloused finger dragged across the glass screen, leaving a glowing trail of digital ink. I hit confirm. The screen loaded for 3 tense seconds before a bright green checkmark appeared, followed by a bold confirmation message. The transfer was completely successful. I refreshed the main dashboard. My total net worth, which had just been $4.5 million a minute ago, now read $0.00. Overnight, sitting in the dark guest bedroom, I had made myself bankrupt on paper. I had absolutely nothing left to my name. If Rachel somehow managed to win the conservatorship on Tuesday, she would be appointed the legal guardian of a completely penniless old man. I smiled, a dark, cold satisfaction washing over me. I unplugged the tablet, shut it down, and hid it safely back inside the false bottom of my tool bag. I pulled myself out of the wheelchair and crawled into bed, pulling the damp covers up to my chin. The physical pain in my leg was still there, but my soul felt lighter than it had in a week. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the jaws were ready to snap shut. The next 4 days passed in a haze of calculated deception. I continued to play the role of the broken, mindless old man, perfectly drooling at the dinner table, staring blankly at the walls, and allowing Todd to violently handle my shattered leg without showing a single spark of resistance. Rachel and Greg grew increasingly confident. By the time Tuesday morning finally arrived, they did not even bother to speak to me as a human being. They treated me like a broken piece of furniture that needed to be moved. They dressed me in a faded, wrinkled flannel shirt and a pair of stained sweatpants, deliberately making me look neglected and pathetic. Greg practically shoved me into my wheelchair, his hands rough and impatient. They loaded me into the back of a specially rented accessible van, not uttering a single word to me, during the 30-minute drive into the heart of downtown Atlanta. The Fulton County Courthouse was a massive, imposing structure of polished granite and towering glass windows. As Greg wheeled me through the heavy security doors and into the bustling lobby, my heart began to pound, a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee, echoing with the hurried footsteps of lawyers and anxious defendants. We rode the crowded elevator up to the 4th floor in absolute silence. Rachel stood directly in front of me, nervously adjusting the lapels of her conservative, expensive navy blue designer suit. She had pulled her hair back into a tight bun, wearing minimal makeup to ensure she looked the part of an exhausted, devoted daughter, carrying the heavy weight of the world on her delicate shoulders. We moved down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor and entered courtroom 4B. It was a sterile, intimidating room paneled in dark walnut, lined with rows of uncomfortable wooden benches. Greg parked my wheelchair awkwardly at the respondent table, leaving me facing the towering wooden bench where the judge would soon preside. I slouched forward, letting my chin rest on my chest, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. I kept my eyes unfocused, but from beneath my lowered brow I scanned the room with the precision of a hawk. The courtroom was mostly empty, save for a bored-looking court reporter and a weary bailiff standing near the side door. There was no sign of Bradley Pierce yet. I had specifically instructed him to wait outside until the absolute perfect moment. I needed Rachel to commit fully to her perjury on the official court record before we sprang the trap. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden door behind the bench opened and Judge Eleanor Hastings walked into the room. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for processing probate cases with ruthless efficiency. The bailiff instructed us to rise. Greg stood up straight, smoothing his expensive tie, while Rachel placed a gentle, perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder, sighing softly to draw the judge's attention to my supposed inability to stand. Judge Hastings sat down, adjusting her reading glasses, and opened the thick manila folder containing the forged documents Rachel had filed. The judge looked over the rim of her glasses, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling heavily on Rachel. We are here today to review the petition for permanent conservatorship over the person and estate of Richard Dalton, the judge announced, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. The petitioner is the respondent's daughter, Rachel Montgomery. You may proceed. Rachel stood up slowly. She walked over to the wooden podium in the center of the room, gripping the edges tightly, as if she needed the physical support just to remain standing. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the performance of a lifetime officially began. Your Honor, Rachel started, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. I am here today because my father, the man who raised me and loved me, is simply no longer there. Over the past year, we have watched his mind slowly slip away into the dark shadows of severe dementia. It started with forgotten conversations, but it has escalated into something truly dangerous. Last month, in a state of deep cognitive confusion, he caused a horrific car accident that nearly took his life and shattered his leg. Since we brought him into our home to care for him, his condition has deteriorated completely. He does not know where he is. He cries out for my mother who passed away 10 years ago. He cannot feed himself, bathe himself, or understand basic financial concepts. Rachel paused, letting a single brilliant tear escape her eye and roll down her cheek. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a tissue to dab delicately at her face. It completely breaks my heart to stand here today. Your Honor, she whispered, her voice cracking beautifully. I love my father more than anything else in this entire world. But he is a profound danger to himself. He is vulnerable. He needs constant specialized psychiatric care that we can no longer provide at home. I am asking the court to grant me full legal guardianship over his medical decisions and his financial estate, so I can protect the assets he worked so hard to build and ensure he is placed in a secure facility where he can be safe for the rest of his days. I sat there in my wheelchair, quietly listening to every single poisonous word falling directly from her lying mouth. She was wrapping my execution in the warm, comforting blanket of a daughter's love. She wanted the judge to hand over my $4.5 million, effectively paying her to lock me in a rural asylum. Judge Hastings nodded sympathetically, turning the pages of the forged medical evaluation. Is there any legal counsel present today representing Mr. Dalton? She asked the quiet room, peering over her glasses. Yes, Your Honor. A booming voice echoed from the back of the room. I am here to represent Mr. Richard Dalton. The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung completely open, striking the wooden stops with a resounding violent crack. Bradley Pierce, my trusted attorney of 20 years, strode confidently down the center aisle. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two towering men wearing dark suits, their federal badges clearly visible on their leather belts. The entire courtroom froze. Rachel gasped loudly, her fake, carefully practiced tears drying up instantly as she gripped the edges of the wooden podium. Greg spun around in his chair, the blood draining completely from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. I did not wait for Bradley to reach the front of the room. I gripped the thick armrests of my wheelchair and firmly planted my good left foot onto the polished marble floor. With a sharp, determined inhale, I pushed my body upward. I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight, ignoring the dull throb in my casted leg. I reached up and quickly unbuttoned the oversized, stained flannel shirt they had forced me to wear, letting it drop to the floor, to reveal the sharp, custom-tailored dress shirt and expensive silk tie I had secretly put on underneath that morning. I was no longer the pathetic, drooling victim they had wheeled into this room just minutes ago. I looked exactly like the powerful, commanding structural engineer who had built empires from steel and concrete. Bradley reached my side and handed me a pair of sleek, black forearm crutches. I gripped the ergonomic handles, feeling the familiar, undeniable strength return to my broad shoulders. Judge Hastings watched this miraculous transformation with wide, thoroughly stunned eyes. Counselor, she demanded, her voice cutting through the heavy, stunned silence of the room. What is the meaning of this interruption? And who exactly are these men standing in my courtroom? Bradley stepped directly up to the high wooden bench, placing a massive, incredibly thick stack of legal folders directly in front of the judge. Your Honor, he stated clearly, his voice ringing with absolute, unwavering authority. We are here to submit a formal motion to dismiss this highly fraudulent petition immediately. Furthermore, we are presenting undeniable concrete evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy. The men standing behind me are special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They are here to execute multiple high-level arrest warrants based on the evidence contained within those files. My client Richard Dalton is not suffering from any form of cognitive dementia. He has been systematically and intentionally poisoned with heavy antipsychotic medications by his own daughter and son-in-law in a cold, calculated attempt to steal his entire life savings. Rachel let out a high-pitched, breathless sound, stumbling backward from the podium as if she had been physically struck. "That is an absolute lie," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. "He is completely crazy. He does not know what he is saying. The sickness has ruined his brain." I turned to face her, leaning heavily on my strong metal crutches. My expression was colder than the winter steel I used to build my bridges. "The sick game is finally over, Rachel," I said, my voice steady, deep, and completely lucid. "I know all about the psychiatric bed hidden down in the basement. I know about the haloperidol pills you maliciously crushed into my evening soup. I know about your evil plans to dump me in the Pine Ridge Asylum. And I know about the first-class plane tickets to Belize." Greg leaped up from the respondent table, his eyes darting frantically toward the side exit door. But the two federal agents instantly moved to block the aisle, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Judge Hastings quickly opened the folders Bradley had provided. She rapidly scanned the real certified medical evaluation conducted by my personal physician just hours prior, confirming I was in perfect cognitive health. She reviewed the hidden camera footage captured on my tablet, the scanned receipt from the black market mechanic who deliberately cut my brake lines, and the horrifying emails detailing Rachel's inquiry to abandon her own daughter to the foster care system. The judge's face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson red. "There is one more matter, Your Honor," Bradley continued, turning his head to look directly at Greg. "The petitioners claim they desperately need legal control of Mr. Dalton's estate to manage his $4.5 million financial portfolio. But even if this court had tragically granted the conservatorship today, they would have found absolutely nothing to manage. Last Thursday night, my client legally transferred his entire net worth into an irrevocable, untouchable financial trust. The sole protected beneficiary of that trust is his granddaughter, Lily. Mr. Dalton is officially penniless on paper. The massive fortune they tried to steal simply does not exist anymore." The sheer, absolute devastation that washed over Greg's face was a masterpiece of total despair. His knees literally buckled beneath his weight, and he collapsed heavily back into his wooden chair. He realized in that exact second that he had failed completely. The violent loan shark syndicate would be coming for him, and he had absolutely no money to save his own life. Rachel fell to her knees right there in the middle of the aisle, burying her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. But these were not crocodile tears anymore. This was the terrifying, agonizing reality of a selfish woman watching her entire life crumble into dust. Judge Hastings slammed her heavy wooden gavel down, the loud sound echoing like a cannon shot. "This petition is completely and permanently denied," the judge barked, her eyes blazing with righteous, uncontrollable anger. "Federal agents, you may proceed with your duties." The two federal officers stepped forward without a single word of hesitation. They grabbed Greg by his expensive suit jacket, hauling him roughly to his feet. The cold, sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent courtroom. Another agent pulled Rachel up from the floor, firmly securing her shaking hands behind her back. She thrashed wildly against the officer, screaming loudly for me to help her, begging for my forgiveness, crying out that she was still my little girl. I looked her dead in the eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but profound pity for the hollow, greedy monster she had chosen to become. "You stopped being my daughter the exact moment you put a violent price tag on my life," I whispered coldly. They were dragged out of the courtroom in utter disgrace, facing decades in federal prison for attempted murder, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. The massive wooden doors swung shut behind them, finally ending the darkest chapter of my entire existence. The horrific nightmare was officially over. Later that afternoon, with the full, unwavering backing of the court and Child Protective Services, I was granted immediate emergency custody of Lily. I walked out of that imposing granite courthouse, with my brave little granddaughter holding tightly to my hand. We did not go back to the cold, soulless mansion in Alpharetta. We drove straight back to my safe, quiet, familiar house in Atlanta. The house I had built with love, hard work, and unshakable values. Sitting on my porch that evening watching Lily play safely in the warm sunlight of the garden, I finally found my peace. The money was safe waiting for her when she was old enough to truly understand its immense value. But I had learned a painful lesson that no amount of wealth could ever teach. Money can build a house, but it can never buy a conscience. Sometimes the family you choose or the one you save is the only family that matters.